They told me a welder wasn't good enough for their daughter. 16 years later, my mother-in-law showed up at my front door in Oakville with nothing but a plastic grocery bag and tears running down her face, asking if she could come in. I still haven't decided if I made the right call letting her. Mining doesn't matter as much as the story does, but I'll tell you, I was 22 when I met my husband at a Tim Hortons on Spears Road. He was still in his work clothes, Carhartt jacket, steel-toed boots, a smear of something dark on his forearm that he kept trying to wipe off with a napkin. He'd been doing an apprenticeship with a local fabrication shop and had just finished a 12-hour shift. I was doing my undergrad at Sheridan, studying social work, and I'd stopped in to grab a large double-double before a night class. He held the door for me. That's it. That's how it started. His name was Connor. He had this way of listening, really listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk, that I hadn't encountered much at 22. We dated for 8 months before I brought him home to meet my parents in Burlington. My mother had grown up in a family where credentials meant everything. Her father was a cardiologist. Her brother was a partner at a Bay Street law firm. She herself had a master's in education and had spent 20 years as a vice principal. My father lectured in economics at McMaster. They weren't cruel people. I want to be honest about that. They were just certain about what a life should look like, certain about what kind of man their daughter should end up with. Connor walked in wearing a clean button-down shirt he'd clearly ironed himself, brought a bottle of Ontario Red from the LCBO, and shook my father's hand like he meant it. And within 45 minutes, my mother found a way to bring up the trades. She wasn't aggressive about it. She was surgical. So the welding, is that something you see as a long-term career, or more of a stepping stone, as if it were a gentle curiosity? As if she weren't measuring him with a ruler he didn't know existed. Connor smiled and said he loved the work, that he was working toward his Red Seal certification, that there was real money in it once you built a reputation. He talked about the infrastructure projects coming to Hamilton, about the union protections, about eventually wanting to start his own shop. My mother smiled back, thin, polite, finished. The drive home was quiet. Connor didn't say anything until we turned onto the QEW, and then he just said, "She's not going to like me." Not a question, not wounded, just a fact. He was filing away. I told him he was wrong. I was wrong. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. I was 23. We weren't trying, but we weren't not trying either. We talked about kids, talked about the future, and when that test came back positive, I sat on the bathroom floor of our apartment on Trafalgar Road and felt something I can only describe as terrified joy. The fear was practical. The joy was bone deep. Connor sat down on the floor next to me. We ate cereal on the bathroom tiles and talked about names until 2 in the morning. I called my mother the next day. The silence on the phone lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "How far along?" "About 6 weeks." Another silence. "And you're keeping it." It wasn't a question either. She already knew the answer, and she was already doing something else in her head, calculating, rearranging, figuring out how to manage what I just handed her. "Mom, yes, of course. We need to talk in person." That conversation happened 4 days later at their house. My father sat at the kitchen island with his coffee and let my mother do most of the talking. What she said, essentially, was this: they loved me, they wanted what was best for me, and they did not believe that Connor was it. A welder with no degree and no trajectory, as she put it, was not what they'd raised me to choose. They were worried about financial instability, about my career, about, and this is the part I still can't fully shake, what people would think. "We've built a certain reputation in this community," my mother said. "Your father's colleagues, the people we've known for 20 years, it's not about snobbery. It's about what you deserve." I told her I deserved to make my own choices. She told me that if I chose to continue down this path, the pregnancy, Connor, all of it, they would need to step back. That they couldn't in good conscience support a decision they felt was going to hurt me. My father looked at his coffee the entire time. I drove home and I didn't cry until I was on the highway. And then I cried the ugly kind, the kind where you have to pull over. Connor was waiting at the apartment. I told him everything. He listened. He didn't say anything bad about them. Not one word. And I think that's the moment I knew, really knew, that I'd chosen the right person. We got married in April, just before I started to show. The ceremony was at the Oakville courthouse with two witnesses, Connor's coworker, Dale, and my friend from university, Phoebe. We went for dinner afterward at a place on Lakeshore. Connor ordered the steak. I had soup because I couldn't keep much else down. We drove home and I fell asleep with my head on his shoulder on the couch before 9 o'clock. My parents did not come. They did not send a card. Our daughter was born in late October. We named her Marin. She came out with a full head of dark hair and these enormous, serious eyes, and Connor cried before I did. He held her like she was something he'd been waiting his whole life to carry. I sent my mother a photo. One photo. She replied 3 days later, "She's beautiful." That was all. For a long time, that was all. The years didn't pass gently. They passed like they do when you're actually living, in a blur of diapers and daycare waitlists and arguments about money at 10 at night, and then making up at 11, and then the alarm going off at 5:30 because Connor had an early site call. We moved from Oakville to a semi in Hamilton when Marin was 2 because we could actually afford to own there. Connor got his red seal. He started doing contract work for a firm that was building out a new GO Transit expansion, and his rate went up and then up again. I finished my degree and got a job with a family services organization in Hamilton. It wasn't glamorous. It was home visits and case files and people in the worst moments of their lives, and I loved it in the way you love something that matters. My parents and I had a fragile, occasional contact. Birthday texts, the odd phone call at Christmas that lasted 12 minutes and stayed in safe territory. My mother asked about my job sometimes. She almost never asked about my job sometimes. She almost never asked about Connor. She asked about Marin like she was reading from a script. How is she doing in school? And I answered the same way, and we both pretended that was enough. It wasn't enough. Marin grew up not knowing her grandparents. Not really. She knew they existed. She knew they lived in Burlington. She asked me once, when she was about 7, why we never went there for Christmas, and I told her that our families had a disagreement a long time ago, and that sometimes grown-ups made choices that were hard to undo. She looked at me very seriously and said, "That's kind of sad." And I said, "Yeah, it kind of is." Connor's parents were different. His mom, a warm and loud woman from Brantford who called everyone on and made pierogies from scratch every Easter, was Marin's grandmother in every practical sense. She came to the school plays. She picked Marin up when we had scheduling conflicts. She was at every birthday. When Connor's dad had a minor stroke 3 years ago, Marin was at the hospital within an hour, sitting in the waiting room doing homework because she wanted to be there. That's the family we built, not the one we were given. Marin was 16 when she told me she wanted to be an engineer, civil specifically. She'd done a presentation at school about the Confederation Bridge and come home lit up in a way I'd never seen before. Connor took her to an open house at Waterloo the following spring. I watched them walk around the campus in my phone photos. Her in her hoodie, him in his jacket, both of them pointing at things, and something in my chest did something complicated. She got into Waterloo's engineering program at 17. Early admission. I called my mother to tell her. I don't know exactly why. Some part of me still wanted something. Acknowledgement, maybe. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's wonderful. You must be so proud." "We are," I said. Connor's been helping her with the math for years. She has his brain for spatial stuff. There was a small pause. "Good," she said, and I could hear it. Not cruelty, just the persistent inability to give him anything. I didn't call her again for 4 months. Marin started at Waterloo in September. The dorms, the roommate drama, the first midterm that nearly broke her, we toughed through all of it. She called Connor as much as she called me, which I took as a sign that we'd done something right. The call I didn't expect came on a Tuesday in February 2 years ago now. It was my mother's number, but my father's voice. He rarely called. He sounded smaller than I remembered. Your mother's been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's, he said. We found out last week. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. I sat down at my kitchen table. The February light was flat and gray through the window. How early? I asked. Early enough that she's still functioning well. But the progression, the neurologist says it's variable. We don't really know yet what the timeline looks like. I asked the practical questions, medications, symptoms, whether she was working with a specialist at Juravinsky. I asked if she had support. My father said they were managing. He said they were fine. He didn't ask for anything. He just told me and then said to give his love to Marin and hung up. I sat there for a while. Connor came in from the garage and found me at the table staring at nothing, and I told him. He sat down across from me. He said, "How do you feel?" "I don't know yet," I said. That was honest. The next several months were a slow-motion thing. I started calling my mother more regularly, once a week, then twice. The conversations were different. She was softer somehow, less managed. She talked about her garden and about a book she was reading, and once, unexpectedly, she told me that she thought she'd been too hard on me when I was young. She didn't elaborate. She didn't apologize exactly. But it was the closest she'd come. I didn't push. I wasn't ready to push. Connor knew I was struggling with it. He'd find me sometimes in the evening just sitting, and he'd make tea and sit with me and not ask me to talk if I didn't want to. That's still the thing about him. 16 years in, he doesn't fill silence with noise. The knock at the door came on a Saturday in October. Marin was home for the weekend from Waterloo. Connor was in the backyard doing something with the fence. I was making lunch. The woman standing on my doorstep had my mother's face, but she'd become someone older inside it. She was holding a reusable grocery bag from Farm Boy, and she'd clearly been crying. And when she saw me, she pressed her lips together like she was trying to hold something in and failing. "I should have called," she said. "I know I should have called. I was afraid if I called you'd tell me not to come." I looked at her for a long moment. "You should come in," I said. "Because what else do you say?" Because whatever I'd been preparing for, whatever version of this confrontation I'd rehearsed in the shower 100 times, it had never looked like this. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd taken my father's call about the Parkinson's, and I made her tea, and she cried in that restrained, mortified way that people cry when they're not used to being seen falling apart. She told me my father had been hiding how bad things had gotten, that the medication costs were significant. Her neurologist had recommended a combination of treatments that weren't fully covered under OHIP, and their savings had taken a hit, that the house in Burlington was on the market, that my father had retired early to be her primary caregiver, and they were living off his pension and the equity in the house. And it was fine, they were managing, but she hadn't been sleeping and she'd been thinking about me constantly, and she just needed to. She stopped, looked at her hands. "I need to say that I was wrong," she said, "about Connor, about what I thought mattered. I need you to know that I see it now. I see what you built. I see who he is." She said it like she was reading a prepared statement, but her hands were shaking and her eyes were wet, and I didn't think she was performing. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I heard the back door open and Connor's boots on the kitchen floor, and I watched my mother look up at him. This man she'd spent years finding ways to dismiss, and something crossed her face that I'd never seen there before. Something that looked like shame. Connor looked at her, then at me. He read the room in about 3 seconds the way he always does, and he said, "Can I get you something? There's soup on if you want it." That was it. That was what he said. My mother made a sound I can only describe as a small collapse, and she said, "That would be very kind." Marin came downstairs 10 minutes later and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw the woman at our kitchen table. She'd met my mother maybe 4 times in her entire life, but she looked at me this quick, searching look, and I gave her a small nod and she came in and sat down. What happened over the next 2 hours was not a movie reconciliation. No one hugged dramatically. No one made sweeping declarations. We just talked. My mother told Marin she was proud of her for Waterloo. She asked about the engineering program and actually listened to the answer. Marin, to her credit, was gracious in a way that made my chest ache because my kid has more grace than I do, and she got it from Connor. At one point, my mother looked at Connor and said, "I owe you an apology. A real one. I treated you as if you were less than, and I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Connor looked at her steadily. "Thank you," he said. "That means something." Not, "It's fine." Not, "Don't worry about it." Just, "That means something." Because it did, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. They left before dinner. My father had come too. He'd been in the car the whole time, I found out later, too uncertain to come in. And Connor went out and shook his hand on the driveway, and I watched them talk for a few minutes from the window. I don't know what they said. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the table where my mother had been sitting and tried to locate what I was feeling. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication exactly. It was something quieter than that, a long exhaustion finally getting to set itself down. Marin came up behind me and leaned against the counter. "So," she said. "So," I said. "Are you okay?" I thought about it honestly. "I think so. Yeah." She was quiet for a second. Then, "She seems like she's carrying a lot." "She is." "Is that why she came?" It was a fair question. A sharp question. Because yes, my mother came when things got hard. When the security she'd built her identity around started to shift. When the certainty she'd lived by got expensive. "Probably partly," I said. "But I think she also just finally got there." Marion nodded slowly. She looked like Connor in that moment. That same stillness. "Are you going to let them be part of things?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I think that's a conversation we have slowly." "Okay," she said. And then she went back upstairs, and I could hear her on a call with someone from school, laughing about something, living her life in the way that 20-year-olds live their lives. Forward, always forward. My parents listed the house in Burlington in November. They found a 2-bedroom condo in Stony Creek, close enough that it wasn't a whole ordeal. My father joined a Parkinson's caregiver support group through the Hamilton Health Sciences Network. My mother started physio twice a week for the tremor in her right hand. I visit now, once or twice a month. Sometimes Connor comes. Sometimes it's just me. We're careful with each other still. Deliberate, like people who know how easily things can break and are trying to be worth the care this time. It's not the family I would have designed from scratch, but I stopped needing it to be perfect a long time ago. What I needed was what I already had. A man who held the door and listened when I talked and sat on the bathroom floor eating cereal at 2 in the morning, and has never once made me feel like I was the wrong choice. They built 4 generations of credentials in that Burlington house. Connor built a life with his hands, one shift at a time, 1 year at a time, in a city that actually needed what he could do. Marin is going to build bridges. I think that's exactly right. I think about Connor standing at the stove that Saturday, asking my mother-in-law if she wanted soup. 16 years of being looked past, talked around, quietly dismissed as not enough, and that's what he chose to do with the moment. Not a confrontation, not a speech, just soup. That's not passivity, that's character. And character, I've come to understand, is the thing you build quietly over years when nobody's watching and nobody's applauding. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up in Carhartt and steel-toed boots and holds the door. There's a version of this story where I became bitter, where the silence from Burlington calcified into something permanent and I let it. I had every right to. But I watched what bitterness did to the people who chose it, how it made them smaller over time, how it turned every present moment into a referendum on an old wound. I didn't want that for Marin. I didn't want it for Marin. So I chose, slowly and imperfectly, to stay open to the possibility that people could grow. Not because they deserved the chance, necessarily, but because staying closed was going to cost me more than it cost them. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you when you're young. The consequences of your choices don't always land where you aimed them. My in-laws thought they were protecting something, a reputation, a legacy, a certain idea of what success looked like. What they actually did was exile themselves from their own grandchild's life. They missed 16 years of Marin. They missed the school plays and the Easter dinners and the late-night kitchen conversations that are the actual substance of a family. No credential can buy that back. And Connor just kept showing up. He got his red seal. He built his reputation shift by shift. He helped Marin with her spatial reasoning at the kitchen table on Tuesday evenings until she understood it well enough to get into Waterloo engineering at 17. He didn't need anyone's validation to know the work mattered. That kind of inner steadiness. Knowing what you're worth without needing someone else to confirm it is the hardest thing to teach and the most important thing to have. Marin has it. I see it in how she moves through the world. She didn't grow up with a lot of extended family approval, but she grew up with two parents who were honest about hard things and didn't pretend that life owed them ease. I think that's why she handled my mother-in-law's arrival with more grace than I could have managed. She hadn't spent years rehearsing the confrontation. She'd spent years building herself. If I've learned anything from all of it, from the courthouse wedding and the silent Christmases and that October Saturday at my kitchen table, it's that the life you construct with your own hands, out of real choices and real love, and the willingness to keep going when it's genuinely difficult, is sturdier than anything inherited. My in-laws built their identity on credentials and community standing. Connor built ours on showing up. One of those things is still standing. Marin is going to build bridges. That feels exactly right to me. Not because it's poetic, but because it's true. She is the bridge between what her father's family was and what we chose to become instead. I don't know what the next few years look like with my mother-in-law. We're careful with each other, and careful is okay. Careful means we're both trying. That's enough for now, it really is.